So that brings us to our passage, which I'm going to read for you. This is Revelation chapter 6. And I'm going to begin to read in verse 9. And this is what it says. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves. I was reading this week and I came across a story. It's from a book called Creature of the Word by Matt Chandler, Josh Patterson, and Eric Geiger. They tell the following story. You may know this story because it's been made into a movie, a Disney movie. But I'm gonna read what they say about this. One of the most unique sporting events in the world did not begin as a sporting event. Each year, riders and their dogs race more than 1,000 miles for several days through the Alaskan snow, from Anchorage to Nome for the Iditarod, the famous dog sled race. But the genesis of Iditarod was something very serious. In 1925, hundreds of children in Nome had been exposed to diphtheria. At this point in history, children around the world died from the highly contagious disease because widespread vaccinations had not yet been introduced. The only serum to combat the disease was far away in Anchorage. To get the serum to Nome quickly, it was first carried by train to Nenana. Then teams of riders, known as mushers, and their dogs, strategically placed along the path, carried the serum to Nome via a relay. More than 150 dogs and 20 mushers, were involved in the heroic efforts, which became called the Great Race of Mercy. With passion and intensity, the mushers hurtled the 300,000 units of life-saving serum across the Alaskan countryside, arriving in Nome in only 127 hours, a record that has yet to be broken. By combining the right medicine with radical effort, hundreds of lives were saved. Well, they continue. While the Iditarod had an amazing origin, it is now just another sporting event. The teams race a similar path, but the motivation is different. They still tie sleds behind dogs, but they're not racing to save lives anymore. The same is often true of churches. If we are not intentional, what was once a life-saving mission can become much less. As a church, we can gather people and go through the motions of Christian discipleship without a sense of the life-giving message and mission we have been given. The race is on and the stakes are high. What mission are you on? Had to ask myself that question this week. What would you be willing to give up for the sake of your mission? Well, we're in the book of Revelation, and I want to review just for a moment. So the author of the book of Revelation has opened a window for us. And it's not as if it looks at heaven way out there. It's as if heaven is right here around us. And when he opens that window, we can peer into the throne room, which is there. As the scriptures say, God is around us. He's in us and he moves around us. The throne room is there. We just can't see it right now. So he's opened a new window into a dimension. It's the throne room. And what John is telling us is things are not as they seem. So our lives here feel like this is the only reality, but John wants us to understand that there is a reality that we do not see, and in fact, the true reality to which our world belongs. That God is on the throne, and he not only rules in heaven, but he rules all of the affairs of mankind. That's the point of the book of Revelation. So we have a picture of God on the throne with a scroll, and on the scroll is written what is the history, God's history for humanity, which includes salvation, which includes bringing his people to himself in heaven. But the scroll is tied up with 7 seals, and John is dismayed because it seems as though there's no one worthy to open the scroll, until he turns and he sees the Lamb who was slain, the one who was truly worthy, the one who gave his life for his people. And so as we put our attention on the seals, we've begun to look at these 7 seals. Last week we looked at the first 4 seals. Each one of them, or the seals in general, are about how mankind is trying to usurp God off of his throne and usurp Jesus from being the Lord of all. Mankind will do all that he can do to usurp God's rightful place. So we saw that in the first seal, and I'm going to keep dripping sweat here because I, unlike you, am in the sun. Enjoy that. So the first seal corresponds to unjust rulers, and we looked at that. The second seal corresponds to those who would steal the peace. The third seal corresponds to those who would bring injustice on the earth. And the fourth seal corresponds to the curse on the earth that brings forth famine and diseases. All these things seemingly have great power in our world, and it is what we see around us. It's the main thing that we see around us. But the message of Revelation, again, is that Jesus is on the throne. He's ruling and he's reigning, and one day all of these evil things will be done away with. But today we come to the 5th seal. We're just going to consider the 5th seal. It's another great injustice. The 5th seal is about the martyrs. The martyrs who have given their lives for the sake of following King Jesus. And there have been thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands through history that have given their lives for the sake of Jesus. While the first 4 seals tell us about the woes that will happen on the earth, the 5th seal is actually a refocus back on heaven. So the first 4, we've been looking at the earth. Now we're looking back at heaven again, and we see the martyrs. Now remember that Revelation was written to 7 churches that were experiencing persecution. And in many ways, the book was there to encourage those who would suffer for the sake of Christ, those who would suffer because of persecution. So this 5th seal is a reminder to the church of the many that have gone before and have given their lives for the sake of Jesus and his kingdom. Remember what Jesus says to the church in Smyrna. This was some time back in chapter 2. He says to them, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." The promise for these martyrs was that they would receive the crown of life. It should actually be encouraging to us. Sometimes we think the worst thing in the world would be for someone to take our lives for the sake of Christ. But the message of Revelation is no. It's actually encouraging. Martyrdom seems like a difficult thing, but when you look at it in the context of this passage, you see that martyrdom doesn't mean the end at all. In fact, death is only the beginning. And it's the death of the martyrs. It's the death of the martyrs that God uses to move his kingdom along. His martyrs are crying out for justice, and we know that one day Jesus will be the lion that will come in and set everything right, destroy all evil. We know that. But his methods are different in our world. His methods are different. Today, he is the Lamb. He's the Lamb that was slain. The way that he brings his kingdom to bear on earth is through sacrifice. Not only his sacrifice, but our sacrifice. This is the way he brings his kingdom to bear. It's the way of love. It's the way of laying down our lives for one another. What Jesus is teaching us here is that since he gave his life for his people, we should be willing to give our lives for his sake. Mark Batterson, in his book Chase the Lion, tells about a modern-day martyr. With his hands tied behind his back, missionary J.W. Tucker was beaten, and then with 60 of his Christian compatriots, he was thrown into the crocodile. It wasn't ISIS or Al-Qaeda who claimed responsibility. The attack took place on November 24th, 1964, at the hands of Congolese rebels. Our natural instinct is to feel sorry for Tucker, whose earthly life was seemingly cut short. But life can't be cut short when it lasts for all eternity. A holy empathy for his wife and children who survived the terrorist attack is biblically mandated. But heaven gained a hero in a long line of heroes who trace their genealogy back to the first Christian martyr, Stephen. In the grand scheme of God's good, pleasing, and perfect will, eternal gain infinitely offsets earthly pain. God doesn't promise us happily ever after. He promises so much more than that. Happily forever after. It was that eternal perspective that inspired J.W. Tucker to risk his earthly life for the gospel. Tucker didn't fear death because he had already died to self. It wasn't an uncalculated risk that led J.W. Tucker into the Congo during a civil war. He counted the cost with his missionary friend Morris Plotz. Plotz tried to convince his friend not to go. If you go in, he prophetically pleaded, you won't come out. To which Tucker responded, God didn't tell me I had to come out. He only told me I had to go in. What mission are you on this morning? What would you be willing to die for? Well, let's talk about the passage a little bit. First, it tells us the location of the souls of the martyrs in heaven. It says, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain, in verse 9. I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain. Well, why under the altar? In the Old Testament, the sacrificial system was in place, and the priest would slaughter animals, and they would drain the blood on the altar, and the blood would flow down under the altar. It was the symbol of the sacrifice that the blood, the life was in the blood, and it oozed out. And it was down there under the altar. See, it is in a very real sense that it's the martyrs throughout the centuries that have carried forth the plan of King Jesus. The power of Jesus is not like the power that we see today, where armies come in and try to crush the opposition. The power of Jesus lies in the fact that he was slain. This is what broke the power of sin. It broke the back of the power of sin. This is what broke the back of the enemy of our souls. Jesus went to a cross like a lamb, and he was slaughtered. He entrusted himself to his Father, who poured out his judgment on his beloved Son. But it had to be this way, of course, because of the sins of his people. He had to pay the penalty for us, or we would not be saved. And so Jesus' call to his people is that God might be strong in their weakness. That's the point. We lay down our lives in absolute surrender, knowing that God will do what he's going to do. He will be powerful. We don't need to be powerful. He is the powerful one in us. It's through weakness that he accomplishes his purposes. And so Jesus' call to his people is that God might be strong in their weakness. Our cry is, pour me out so that you can accomplish your purposes. Verse 10 says, they cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? It is the blood of the martyrs that calls God to action, to rise up. And this is what he does. It is actually through sacrifice of many martyrs that his kingdom advances. It's very upside down, brothers and sisters. It's very different from what we think. If you want to get ahead in this life, you need to be strong. You need to be powerful. You need to be the knowledgeable one. You need to be the one with the gifts and with the intelligence and with all the things. You need to be strong. But the way of the kingdom is completely opposite. It is a complete surrender, a completely giving our lives on the mission of God and letting Him work. That's what the blood of the martyrs is all about. In Iran, Mehdi Dibaj, an Assemblies of God minister, spent nearly 10 years in prison for his faith. A convert from Islam in 1955, Dibaj is given every opportunity by the authorities to regain his freedom. First, he's asked to sign a paper admitting he was wrong and that he wants to return to Islam. When this fails, he's beaten, tortured, and put through mock executions. His wife succumbs to the pressure. She converts to Islam and marries another man, though Dibaj's children refuse to renounce their faith. Next, Dibaj is offered freedom in exchange for admitting he is mentally unstable. It is only after fellow pastor Haik Hofspayan, chairman of Iran's Protestant Council, after he courageously sends out an open letter to Western media publicizing Dibaj's plight, that he's freed. But not long after, Pastor Haik disappears and his murdered body is found. Still, Dibaj refuses to flee and continues his pastoral ministry. Soon, he meets the same fate anyway. What is the result? In 1977, there were only 2,700 evangelicals in Iran out of the population of 45 million. Of these, only 300 were former Muslims. Today, there are close to 55,000 believers, of whom 27,000 are from Muslim backgrounds. God's kingdom advances through the sacrifice of His people. What mission are you on? What would you be willing to give up for the sake of the mission? So why would someone give their life as a martyr? Well, we have some promises here. In verse 11, it says they were given a white robe. And by the way, little parentheses, the sign we have here is that the minute you die, you are instantly with the Lord. When you die on this earth, immediately you're with the Lord. That's a wonderful promise. But here they are given a white robe. So a white robe stood for purity. This has the gospel written all over it. Because of Jesus' sacrifice for them, they stand before the throne of God as pure and perfect in His sight. This is the gospel, of course. We stand before God, those of us that have said, Jesus, I need you. We stand before God as pure in His sight, as if we had never sinned. We stand with His record of righteousness. We stand with white robes. But how much more than the martyrs who have given their lives for the sake of the gospel? What a wonderful promise. The promise of the white robe. Another promise, he goes on and he says, then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer. Their labor was over. They are resting around the throne. No longer do the martyrs struggle. They don't struggle with sin. No longer do they have to struggle with a sinful world. No longer do they have to face the oppression of the enemy. They are invited to rest. Well, clearly, we're talking about an intermediate state. There is an intermediate state. When we die on this earth, our bodies go into the ground. Our souls go to heaven. One day, they will be reunited. When Jesus comes again, they will be reunited, and we have new bodies, glorious bodies, where we will rejoice and probably be busy for eternity. Still learning, still working, still doing many, many things for the glory of the kingdom. But there's an intermediate state here. And in this intermediate state, it just feels good. They are called to rest a little bit longer. And so the martyrs cry out for Jesus to come and conquer, but in the meantime, they rest from their labors. In a very real sense, those who give their lives to Jesus completely, surrender Let him be the power. Those are the people that have rest for their souls, even here, in the midst of persecution or whatever there is, in the midst of unrest, in the midst of pandemics, in the midst of everything. Those who give their lives and surrender completely are at rest. But we struggle with that, don't we? I struggle with that. And so the martyrs cry out for Jesus, but they rest. Well, how long will they have to rest? Well, it tells us, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. Well, clearly there's a specific number of martyrs that will be killed. We ask ourselves, why is Jesus waiting? Why is he waiting? Why isn't he doing something about this? Well, first, he is. We don't always know what he's doing, but he's constantly doing. He's constantly advancing. But there are also a certain number. It may very well be that some of the martyrs aren't even born yet, and he's waiting until they're born. He's waiting until the full number has come in before he makes his move. So, martyrdom in Scripture is always viewed as a wonderful thing. It advances the work of the kingdom, and there's a glorious rest that awaits the martyrs and awaits us. So we might ask the question, why is it that we need to suffer? Why does Jesus want us to suffer? Well, the answer, of course, is that it is only in suffering where we find out where our hearts really are. When everything is going peachy keen, we don't need him. It's in suffering where we say, who are we really? And where am I going to go for help? Who am I going to run to? What is my life really about? If I'm suffering and it's only about this life, then I'm beyond all people the most miserable. But if I have hope, then that changes everything, doesn't it? Our country's going through it right now, aren't we? We've been cooped up in a pandemic that we're incredibly sick of. And then we've had tremendous social upheaval. And if there are two things that Americans idolize, it's our comfort and our control. And both of them have been yanked. And everybody's on edge. I'm on edge. I'm no different than anybody. We don't like getting our comfort taken away, and we certainly don't like our control of our circumstances getting taken away. But the way of the Lamb is different. The way of the Lamb is what happened to missionary Karen Watson. She counted the cost of what it was to follow Jesus. That's why she left a letter with her pastor before she went to Iraq. She went there to provide humanitarian relief in the name of Jesus, but she was gunned down in that country. The letter began, if you're reading this, it means that I've died. And after saying some nice words to her family, she sums up what it was for her to follow Christ. To obey was my objective. To suffer was expected. His glory, my reward. What mission are you on? What would you be willing to die for? The way of the Lamb is what happened to Maximilian Kolbe in February 1941. Father Kolbe was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to Auschwitz. He was a Polish monk who founded a Franciscan order in Warsaw. Eventually, he was assigned to Barracks 14, where he continued to minister to his fellow prisoners. He would nod his understanding as men poured out their hearts, and then he would raise his emaciated arm and make the sign of the cross in the foul air of the packed barracks. The cross, he thought, Christ's cross has triumphed over its enemies in every age. I believe in the end, even in these darkest days in Poland, the cross will triumph over the swastika. I pray I can be faithful to that end. Then one night, a man escaped from Barracks 14. The next morning, there was a tension as the ranks of phantom thin prisoners lined up for roll call in the square. Afterwards, the commandant ordered the dismissal of all but Barracks 14, who were forced to stand still in the hot sun all day long. By evening, the commandant would make a lesson out of the fate of this miserable barracks. The fugitive has not been found. 10 of you will die for him in the starvation bunker, he screamed. Anything was better. Death on the gallows or even the gas chambers. This method forced one to go without food and water until death. After the 10 were chosen, the cry rang out from one of the men chosen, "My poor children, my wife, what will they do?" Suddenly there was a commotion in the ranks. A prisoner had broken out of ranks and volunteered to take this crying man's place. It was Father Colby. The frail priest spoke softly, even calmly, saying, "I would like to die in place of one of the men you condemned." The commandant ordered it done, and the 10 were marched to Barracks 11, where they would spend the last of their days. As the hours and days passed, the camp became aware of something extraordinary happening in the death cell. Past prisoners had spent their dying days howling and attacking one another in a frenzy of despair. But now those outside heard the faint sound of singing. For this time the prisoners had a shepherd to gently lead them through the shadows of the valley of death, pointing them to the great shepherd. Francis Kozlowski was the prisoner whose life was spared. He survived Auschwitz, and for 53 years, until his death at age 95, he joyously told everyone about the man who had died in his place. Brothers and sisters, this is what Jesus did for us. Single-minded in his mission, no amount of suffering was too much. How much are we willing to lay down our lives for one another, even if we disagree with one another? How much are we willing to put our lives in Jesus' hands and say, "You are in charge. I give up being in charge. I don't need to be in charge." This is the way of the Lamb. It's laying our lives down. What mission are you on? What would you be willing to give up for the sake of Jesus' mission? That's the gospel, and it changes everything. Let's pray.